Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, former state representative from southern Minnesota, and as usual, joined by Walter Hudson from District 30A, state representative. We're going to discuss this week some bipartisan legislation that maybe we can agree with Democrats on. And we're also going to talk about some of the destruction the Democrats have done so far this legislative session. We've on this show discussed a lot of stuff as it's hit the House because Walter's in the House. Late last night, the Senate passed the driver's licenses for all bill, restoring voting rights for felons as they're released from prison. And that is on its way to the governor's desk to sign into law. This week, they also passed the conversion therapy ban that's went to the governor's desk. And in the debate on the House and Senate, the Democrats blocked amendments to that bill that would actually ban chemically physically mutating children who think they're another gender, just protecting children from that conversion surgery, right? They're preventing conversations with people if that conversation may lead to someone affirming the gender of their birth, but yet at the same time, they've blocked the mutilation of children through surgery and stuff that a lot of doctors say they don't even do, but obviously they do in some instances. And this is going to be a growing trend as they also pass legislation to make Minnesota a sanctuary state for gender surgeries and attracting people from all over the country as other states work to ban this terrible practice. So that's on the negative side. Walter, you were part of that debate on the floor on the transgender ban, the conversion therapy ban. How did you see it going down?
Well, I actually wasn't part of the debate because I have been under the weather in a bad way for the better part of a week, and so I took Monday off. But from what I heard of how the debate went, and of course my familiarity with the issue is such that this is and apparently there were Republicans who voted for this. I talked to one of them as I was roaming the halls of the Capitol of the state's office building yesterday. And for some folks, they see this as a difficult issue because they feel as though there are circumstances where it can in fact be abusive to take somebody who identifies as gay, for instance, and try to quote unquote pray the gay away, and convince them that their same-sex attraction is illegitimate. I think that those concerns might be legitimate in certain circumstances. But I think to the extent that those concerns have legitimacy is greatly outweighed by the fact that this is a bill that is part of an overall agenda to effectively make it illegal to affirm reality. And specifically to affirm reality to children who are the segment of the population that is in most need of reality affirmation. Okay. That's my job as a parent, as a father. My job is to take my kid from believing he's Spider-Man and playing with toys to being able to be a productive, rational, objective member of society who produces values for himself and for others. And so you take away my capacity to seek care for him that affirms his identity as a him, while simultaneously enabling professional intervention without my consent in some cases, in many cases, through the school system, through the medical health system, to convince him that he is something that he objectively is not. To me, that makes the vote really easy. And even though, I respect my colleagues who have different views on this, and I certainly don't want to put them through the ringer, but I cannot personally, in good conscience, ever support a bill like this that takes a side on how parents can pursue the mental health and care of their own children. That's something that government should have no say in whatsoever. None.
Yeah. And I think it's important to also understand, this is a one-way street that they've created that all of the medical community. So this, again, you said that you talked about praying the gay away. There's a protection for clergy in this bill so that you can still have conversations with people about their gender identity and homosexuality, whatever. That is still protected. That is always going to be protected. This only applies to licensed medical professionals, so doctors and therapists and such, in school psychologists, all that kind of stuff. So this applies to them. They can have conversations with children about transitioning, about being homosexual, but they can't have conversations that may result in the child affirming the gender of their birth or being straight. And so that, and because that law is passed now, medical professionals, like if someone goes in, goes, yeah, I think I'm another sex, and I'm going to have I'm going to transition from a guy to a girl, and I'm going to have my stuff chopped off. Can the doctor, the doctor should be talking to them about medical problems that could result from the surgery, but could discussing the side effects of having, your body physically altered, could discussing the side effects result in that person not proceeding with that surgery? And wouldn't that be the same conversation where you're ending up the person's like, no, you know what, I'm decided I'm going to remain a guy. So it's moving the bar. It's going to create a threat of a lawsuit, and so I think it could have serious adverse effects, and it will. And that's another reason to have grave concerns about this bill passing and how it's going to be implemented.
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at things in context. And that's one object lesson that I've taken away from my initial weeks as a legislator in St. Paul, is that you cannot view any single piece of legislation on its own merits. And that may sound counterintuitive because you're like, well, of course you should. And even when it comes to how we debate things, we have rules that you can only debate the merits of the item that is before you. But in reality, that rule is abused in order to put blinders on consideration of the broader agenda that any given bill is a part of. And so I think the responsible thing to do as stewards of the public trust is to consider a particular piece of legislation in the overall context of what the other side is ultimately trying to do. And so even if you could make, as some of my colleagues have, some plausible argument that there should be limitations on how mental health professionals can engage with minors when it comes to the issues of sexual orientation or gender identity. Even if you could make that argument, and I don't know how you could, but some people apparently think that you could, you have to acknowledge that this is step one. Like, you're providing them with this passage of this bill, you're providing them with precedent, and you're providing them with a premise upon which they're going to build. And the argument that they're going to make from here going forward is, if it's wrong for a mental health professional to tell a boy that he is a boy, then why is it okay for a pastor to do it? Why is it okay for a teacher to do it? Why is it okay for a parent to do it ultimately? And we know that they believe that those things are wrong. I mean, we can look north to Canada and to other areas in the world where this agenda has advanced further along. We know where this is going, and it's going in opposition to free speech, in opposition to the free practice of religion, in opposition to the Judeo-Christian worldview as such. And even broader than that, like all the Abrahamic religions, none of them are down with this gender ideology nonsense. And so it's a shot across the bow of civilization as it has been known to date. I mean, they are declaring war against the fundamental aspects of what we call civilization with this gender ideology nonsense. Because, listen, the gravity of this cannot be overstated. It really can't. If you're going to create a world where I cannot say what is true when it comes to something as fundamental as the sex of my child, the gender of my child, then I don't have any rights, right? Like, you have intervened in my capacity. You have come between me and my own mind. And you're now saying that I can't live my life according to my own perception of reality. And that's insane. It's more than insane. It's tyrannical, and it only goes in bad directions. The line has to be drawn here. It has to be.
Another issue of the conversion therapy ban is that it only relates, we're told it only relates to children or vulnerable adults. And the term vulnerable adult, I mean, everything that you pass in legislation, the terms have to be defined. It's very important to define all of this stuff. Well, if you look up the term vulnerable adult and how the state defines it, it's, what do we call this? Well, you can just search the statute, but it says a vulnerable adult means any person that's 18 years of age or older who is, it goes to like a resident of an inpatient facility, if you receive services under these distant chapter of law. But it also says if, regardless of where the person resides, whether any type of service is received, possesses a physical or mental infirmity, or any other physical, mental, or emotional dysfunction.
Right.
Okay. You could actually argue that any person who believes they're a different gender has an emotional dysfunction and is therefore a vulnerable adult. So well, it would prevent adults from seeking the service too.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue, I think quite rationally, that anyone who is seeking mental health services by definition has an emotional instability. I mean, that's why they're doing it. Right. I mean, it's and that's not in any way defaming or minimizing. I mean, normal people have emotional issues that sometimes need to be intervened with professionally. There ought to be nothing stigmatizing about that. But to the point of what we're talking about here, you could read that statute and this legislation as any patient who a mental health professional sees in their capacity as a mental health professional is by definition a vulnerable adult.
Right. And so the ban on this service, so if you're a practitioner that that counsels people, you're a marriage counselor, if you're questioning your sexuality and you have questions, you want to talk it through, and you can come to speak with a licensed practitioner, and then we're told, well, you can't do this service for children or vulnerable adults. And you say, okay, fine, this passes, but it also would ban it for basically everyone because that person has an emotional dysfunction. And so everybody by definition is a vulnerable adult. Now you're shutting down any of these services that exist. And we've been back and forth on the House floor. I don't even think this service exists in the state. You don't have like people advertising that we're going to, set you straight for, $299.99. But it's, again, it moves the bar and has an impact for a lot of different medical practitioners that are going to step away from this and only help people transition. I think, and we see this on social media, there's a lot of people who were transgender who've decided they're no longer that. But many of them went through with chemical alteration, chemical castration, physical castration, and they're regretting this. So to continue to perform the service for children and vulnerable adults, by their definition, I think is a really dangerous practice.
Yeah, no doubt.
Let's talk about mental health issues, because I think on the subject of mental health, we find that there's a lot of bipartisan agreement, and this is going to come up again in the next week or so as we get into discussing red flag laws at the legislature, because if there's one thing we can agree on, I think both sides of the aisle, is that we don't want bad actors to have guns. But it's how you define a bad actor. Is it, obviously someone that's going to go commit a crime? We don't want them to have a gun. But how do you take away a gun from someone? How do you take away a constitutional right from someone who has not yet committed a crime? That is what red flag laws are all about. It's about suspecting this person might do it, or they're going to lose their job, or they're going through divorce, or they're going bankrupt, and they might become mentally unstable. So we're going to ask the court to direct the police to go kick in their door in the middle of the night and take away all their guns, which, by the way, we don't know how many guns they have. But that's the idea of red flag laws, is denying due process. If you're going to take away someone's right, they have a right to understand who their accuser is, face their accuser, defend themselves, and argue why this shouldn't happen. But red flag laws are take away their gun now, and then we can have a conversation over a length of time, and then some bureaucrat's going to decide to maybe return their gun or maybe not. But the bottom line is that we're talking really about mental health. We're talking about someone that has potentially mental health problems. How do you is it right to go and take guns away from people that have mental health problems? And if so, doesn't that dissuade people from seeking treatment if they have a mental health crisis? You talk to a lot of veterans out there. They don't go and seek services from the VA because they're concerned that they could lose their right to own guns. Where do we go from here? How do we allow doctors or psychologists to raise red flags, alert police? I don't know. Where do you think we go from red flag laws and talking about mental health? How do we have this conversation?
Well, I think that Republicans and conservatives have really dropped the ball on this issue, in that we have only, and maybe I just don't, maybe I haven't seen the efforts that have been made. I will allow for that. Maybe there has been a lot of work done in this area that I'm just not privy to. I am not aware of significant, substantial work on the conservative Republican side of addressing mental health systemically, and it is desperately needed. Um, I sat and had a meeting with my sheriff in my district a couple of weeks ago. And when I asked him what he needs in terms of support, the first thing he brought up was mental health issues and mental health services. He took me down the list of the 4 calls since he had been on duty that morning that had come through, and 3 out of the 4 involved people experiencing mental health crises. Yesterday in Public Safety Committee, we heard a bill to start a pilot program to provide specialized intensive mental health services for people who are in county jails. It's starting very, very small. They're only going to be able to service 5 people, but it's a pilot program. That's kind of how it's supposed to work. But one of the things that was stated by one of the testifiers is that our jails and prisons have become warehousing facilities for people who need mental health services. That is terrible, and it's indicative of a systemic problem. Another story I like to tell is here in Albertville. I was on the city council before becoming a state representative, and I won't go into all the details because it would take too long, but we had a issue with the usage of a personal property, like a residential property, where a guy is basically like an industrial hoarder. And by that, I mean, he's got like dumpsters and bulldozers and heavy equipment on his property. And as quickly as you remove it, somehow he finds more and puts it back. It's actually quite amazing. But the way we've tried to address that as a city is by treating it the only way we know how, the way the system is designed, administrative fees and taking him to court. And now we're hiring contractors to go in there and clean up his yard and then charging the bill to his taxes. Well, we know where this is going to go, right? Like eventually it's going to get to the point where he loses his house. And then what's he going to do? Right. There needs to be some recognition of when the criminal system, and, I've got a son who is on the autism spectrum, and because that's where he's at, his reactions are completely different from the types of reactions you would expect from neurotypical, is the word that they use, folks out in the world. And so when it comes to things like law enforcement interactions, if a law enforcement officer, if a sheriff deputy approaches me on the street and issues a verbal command, I'm going to listen, right? Because that's the way my brain is wired, is, oh, something's going on here, I better comply and then find out why later. My son, that's not how he's going to react. He's going to be combative. Now, he's completely harmless, right? Like, he's not going to do anything, but he's going to display all of the behaviors that signal to that officer, this is a threat. I need to escalate. I need to tase. I need to tackle, whatever the thing is. And so my point is that there's this entire blind spot that we have in society right now regarding mental health, how to recognize mental health issues, and how to address them. The way I think of it is this. So there was a time in history, it's hard to conceive of this because we take things for granted that we've always lived with. But there was a time in not too distant history where 911 wasn't a thing, right? You couldn't, if you had a fire, you needed to know the number of the fire department, right? If there was a crime in progress, you needed to know the number of the police department. And if you were traveling and you didn't know the number of the local jurisdiction, you were SOL. So they had to create the 911 system so that you had one number that you needed to remember, three digits, that wherever you were, you could dial that number and it would automatically connect you to relevant emergency services. We need to integrate within that system a way of dealing with mental health crisis. Currently, we don't. We have, there's little hodgepodges here and there of groups that can address this and groups that can address that. And that's one of my frustrations as a legislator, is that I'm constantly hearing these presentations and bills for grants for this, that, and the other thing that address one piece of the puzzle. And the way I look at it is it's kind of like being presented with a jigsaw puzzle one piece at a time and never actually getting to see what the picture is supposed to be. It's very frustrating because it's like, how do you weigh what your priority should be when you don't know what the overall picture that you're aiming for looks like? And the problem from a political perspective, from a partisan perspective, the problem is that Democrats have spent a lot of time thinking about this. They've spent a lot of time thinking about social services. They've spent a lot of time thinking about mental health because it's in their wheelhouse. It's politically advantageous to them. And the solution that they have come up with is the Department of Children and Families. And I sit on that committee, and that's why I'm hearing a lot of this stuff, alongside the stuff I'm hearing in public safety. And it's a giant new state bureaucracy that's basically modeled. It's basically, let's take the Department of Human Services and Minnesota Department of Education and get them freaky and having a baby, and that's going to be the Department of Children and Families. And so the question becomes, we need to have a counter to that. We can't just say, and we will say, no, this is bad. We shouldn't be doing this. It costs too much money, yada, yada, yada. But we need to have a comprehensive systemic vision for what our solution to these problems would be, because merely ignoring them it's not going to work politically, and it's not going to work practically, because these are real problems that people on our side, like sheriffs and police and county workers and our constituents and our neighbors and our family, these are real problems that need to get addressed, and we need to have conservative solutions that align with our principles but still get the problem solved.
Well, I'm going to go back to the point of if you are having a mental health crisis and you seek medical care, a lot of people will understand all of the things that come with it. If they seek medical care because they're going through a crisis, what's going to happen with their gun rights? What's going to happen with, is it going to be a blemish on if they're in school, on their education record? Their classes, will college transcripts be able to, our colleges be able to access this information? Will your employer be able to access this information? We have a great interest from from employers. They want to know whether someone's stable or not. Right, their insurance company is going to want to make sure that they don't have a mentally unstable person at work, right, for liability reasons, for workplace shootings, all these kind of things that come up. There's a great interest from a lot of different sources that they want to tie things to people seeking mental health treatment. And so we have to make a system that's almost like anonymous, where someone can seek treatment without repercussions or blowback. And we need to I don't want to use the words fully fund it, but we need to fund it at a level where people can actually get care. Now, I've been on many calls as a legislator with my local and district school mental health professionals, right? The school counselors that not only help kids decide what college to go to, but deal with a lot of mental health stuff at school. And when I was on a Zoom call with many of them, and I asked about what percentage of your mental health discussions with children have to do with gender and sexual orientation. And it was a great percentage of those. And that's when it gets into this whole, well, that's the conservative opposition to this, is because then we don't want you to have conversations with our children about those type of issues. And that's why you're going to have resistance to expanding the programs. And so we have to have them dump the wokeness of, certain things of their treatment in order to better fund those programs. I think that's going to have to be the agreement. But and also just not tying it to gun rights and things like, the red flag laws, if we want to actually have people seeking the care that they need.
Well, look, I think you highlight exactly why conservatives need to dive head first into the deep end of this topic, because the reason why the wokeness is interfused in these conversations in mental health and social services is because the left, and again, this has been my perception, maybe I'm wrong, but the left has control of this space. Like, they're the only ones who are digging into it. Like, the typical conservative attitude towards these issues is, that's your problem, deal with it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's the conservative response to mental health concerns is kind of like that scene in Airplane where they're all lined up to slap the lady. That's kind of our way of dealing with it, is just, snap out of it, you'll be fine. Snap out of it, you'll be fine. And for some people, look, there are there examples of people who are just incredibly fragile and they ought to be able to deal with their problems and they're choosing not to? Certainly. And that's part of the contribution that we can bring to the table if we take this issue seriously and dig into it, is how do we distinguish between folks who are abusing the system and folks who legitimately need help? How do we provide appropriate services for people that are going to get them on a track where they don't need services anymore? And I've had enough meetings at this point with people who are doing this work, social service work, these different groups that work with different populations in different stages of crisis. And they have almost to a person all said, my goal is to make my job extinct, to work myself out of a job. And I believe that. I believe that they want to get people to a place where they don't need these services anymore. And that should be our goal. The problem is that as things currently stand, the left is the only side of the conversation that's engaging with this problem substantially. And because they're the only ones engaging with it, they're infusing it with their Marxist ideology and their wokeness and their critical theory and the equity and blah, 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 blah. And what we can bring to the table is, slow your roll. Let's make sure this is bipartisan. Let's make sure this is non-political. Mental health services should be non-political.
Yep.
Your fire services should be non-political. Law enforcement should be non-political, right? The only way it's going to be non-political is if we put structures in place and if we take responsibility for it on both sides of the partisan divide to ensure that it's non-political and nonpartisan. And so we got to step up and do more than just say no.
Well, here's another interesting conflict in this debate, and I'm going to go back to my conversation I've had with school mental health professionals. Is I remember talking to a Democrat candidate who was herself a mental health professional, and it was after a school shooting, and we were talking about, how do you find the kids that are going to be the next school shooter? And she said to me, Jeremy, we already know who they are, because they're the kids out there that are crushing frogs with their hands on the playground and doing some, animal torture and all this kind of stuff. And we see them and we have a report that they're doing this and we want to have that conversation. But then we have to go talk to the parents and say, look, Billy was seen doing this and we'd like to meet with him twice a week to talk through some issues. And the parents say, he's just going through a phase. No, you're not going to sit and we don't need to shrink talking to my kid. And so it's almost like the parents are the ones that need the treatment because they're in denial that their kids are having problems or need to address it. And so they can't really give the kids care that they need. So they're trying to go through and change legislation to say, we need to allow school counselors to have conversations with children without parental involvement, which is when we talk about the wokeness side of things and the gender and the sexual orientation stuff, is like it's a non-starter for conservatives. And so there's this balance of parental rights, parental involvement in treatment of their kids that we need to figure out when. And I'll admit, on the sexual orientation stuff, like if somebody thinks they're gay, but their parents are going to beat the crap out of them if they find out they are, is there a point where the kid should be able to talk with a counselor to talk this through without involving the parents? Like that's a tough situation to figure out too. But there's got to be. We have to figure out where the parental involvement is, and figure out all the wokeness conversation, how that's going to go down, and come up with a way to put some guidelines for the mental health treatment in schools, so that maybe they can move forward in figuring out the kids that are most vulnerable and to get them the treatment they need.
Yeah, and again, I think this is why conservatives need to get involved in the thinking and discussing and deliberating about this whole process. Is good. For instance, I think that's an area where conservatives have input that the left would never consider. So when you talk about the hypothetical kid who identifies as gay but doesn't want to tell mom and dad because he's afraid that mom and dad are going to beat him up, like physically abuse him as a result of learning that he identifies as being gay. Well, how is it, like, it seems to me to be grossly inadequate for your solution to that problem to be, well, we just won't tell mom and dad. You're sidestepping the fact that the kid has parents who will beat him up if they don't like something he's doing. Like, if that's a problem in that situation, it's probably a problem in a few situations, right? Like, why are we not intervening in a scenario where a kid has to take into consideration whether or not he's going to be physically abused by his parents? Like, if that should be a red flag that triggers a broader investigation, because there's probably something going on in that home that requires intervention for the safety of that kid that has nothing to do with sexual orientation, right? That's going back to red flag. And this is something I talked about in public safety committee when we heard that bill, about the red flag bill, is that you guys, you portray yourselves, talking about the left now, they portray themselves as being so caring and compassionate and empathetic, but they're actually extraordinarily blind and numb to broader realities. If there's a situation going on with someone where it justifies us suspending due process for the exclusive purpose of going into their home and taking their guns, and then getting back into the squad car and driving away with their guns in the trunk and doing nothing else, like, what are you talking about? If they're at that level where it's so critical that we suspend their due process rights in order to take their guns away from them, they need more help than that, right? Like, they need some real intervention. Like, if they're to that, if you can demonstrate that the situation is that critical, you should be able to arrest that person, right? I mean, if you have probable cause to take their guns away, then you should have probable cause to take them away. You're not solving the full problem.
And we talk about that as we already have these laws in the books that allow you to take someone who's a threat to themselves or others and lock them up for 72 hours against their will to do a wellness check. We already have that in place, and that is not used very much, thankfully. But if someone comes to a point where they need to do a red flag law, in implement that and use it, maybe they should have just been treating the individual and not trying to take guns away, which I continue to go back to. If we have a red flag law, and they'll find quickly that we don't know which guns they have, right? If somebody comes to my door and says, Jeremy, we have an anonymous complaint, we have to take your guns, I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to figure out the two guns that I don't use. And those are the ones that I'm going to hand them and say, here you go. Right. And that's it, So we need to figure out a better solution to get to that same result. And conservatives should do a better job at explaining the process. My wife and I went to a dinner in St. Paul last night to the LEA banquet. And on the way there, we're listening to Minnesota Public Radio News, and they're talking about red flag laws. And they said there's this big report out of Colorado. They studied 100 instances of executing red flag warrants or whatever, and how they didn't work. And they were interviewing sheriffs, and they're going, yeah, well, I mean, they actually use the words taking away someone's right who has not committed a crime. And I'm like, they're finally using our words, like our messaging is getting out there. Cause that's what I can't explain enough to people, is that these people haven't committed a crime. They haven't even been accused of a crime. This is like completely preventative, like trying to like, well, they might possibly do this down the road. So this is unsuspecting person that, kicking their door to try to take their guns, and they haven't been accused of anything. So they're having that conversation and realizing maybe they don't work. They also talked about how so many county sheriffs in Colorado won't actually implement them because they believe them to be unconstitutional, and they swore to uphold the Constitution. Like NPR was reporting that, and it was shocking that a left-leaning media is actually bringing forward a thoughtful discussion on red flag laws, and including talking about how the ACLU is opposed to that, which, this is an organization that I support them on principle because they should be fighting for, individual liberty and stuff. But of course, they've been co-opted by the left. But when they come out against red flag laws, that it's gone too far. And so it was a great conversation to listen to on NPR.
Yeah, no, I mean, the stories are out there to be told. And again, I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have on the right is that we fall back. The left is inherent. This is the way I'm going to summarize it, and people might find it offensive. The left is more creative than we are. The left is more creative than the right is. And the reason why they're more creative is because they've abandoned all limitations, right? Like you're talking about people who literally think a man can transmute into a woman, right? Okay. So they don't have any self-imposed limitations on what they believe is possible. And there's a sense in which that's liberating, right? I mean, if you don't, it's a quality of genius if it's properly channeled. The idea that the impossible is possible, that we can go to the moon, that we can harness the atom, the capacity to believe that you can do something and that you're not bound by convention, you're not bound by what's already known and established and accepted, frees you up to be able to go into creative new directions. And one of the inherent flaws of conservatism is that by its very nature, we exist to conserve. We exist to uphold the status quo and to color within the lines. And there are many, many, many institutions and cases and circumstances where that is entirely 100% appropriate, but it can also be a limiting factor. It can also keep us from exploring the frontiers of what is an increasingly changing societal picture that is only going to advance. I mean, you think about I've got my kid's great grandma still with us. She's still alive. I can't think off the top of my head of the year she was born, but she's been around for a good long time. All right. You think about the amount of societal change that has taken place within the lifetime of somebody who's 80, 90 years old. You think about the amount of change that's taken place in your lifetime, in my lifetime, how different things, in my kid's lifetime, my 14-year-old kid, how much life is different between now and 2009 in terms of technological capability. And then you look at things like ChatGPT, AI, the effect that that's going to have, robotics, all these things that are coming together. The world is changing in exponential fashion in terms of how quickly. We have to have a conservatism that rolls with those punches. We have to have a conservatism that is applicable to the change that we are seeing in the world, rather than simply just objecting to it and saying it's all bad and we gotta stop it. And we gotta hold it back. We gotta hold it at bay. you're not going to be able to hold it all at bay. What you need to be able to do is you need to be part of the conversation that decides how we're going to govern new applications of very old problems. Because at the end of the day, no matter how technologically complicated our lives become, at root, the core issue remains the same, which is that each individual human being is endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that those ought to be properly upheld, and that we ought not violate the rights of others, and that our policy needs to be tailored around ensuring our common welfare. General welfare is the term used in the Constitution. And so conservatives need to be part of that conversation. We need to be proactive. We need to be out ahead. Right now, the Democrats are ahead of the curve in terms of addressing cutting edge societal changes. We need to reverse that. We need to get ahead of the curve. We need to be leaving them in the dust, having them in a place where they got to catch up with us because we're so far out ahead saying, this is where we need to go. This is what we need to do. This is what it needs to look like. And have them be reactive to what we're proposing as opposed to us always being reactive to what they're proposing.
Yeah. Well, it's a very complex discussion. I look forward to having more conversations on mental health. Let's get into a right that is being debated at the legislature. That's the right to mow your lawn with your gas powered lawnmower. This is a bill that was introduced by Heather Edelson in the House that would ban gas powered lawn equipment, which is lawnmowers, leaf blowers, hedge clippers, chainsaws, string trimmers, and brush cutters. Doesn't ban snow blowers. That was one exemption she didn't go after. But basically, everybody has to have electric everything for lawn equipment. And I don't believe it bans the usage of. It's just banning the sale of. So if you're a listener that has a lawn and garden store in Hudson, Wisconsin, you better start ordering your supplies because this is probably going to pass the legislature. But it hits home to a lot of people because they really enjoy going out there and getting their lawnmower going and mowing lawns without having to worry about the children in the Congo mining cobalt for their electric lithium ion batteries for their lawnmower. This is it's created, it's touched a nerve with Minnesotans, and this also only applies to stuff that's under 25 horsepower. Now, my lawnmower is diesel. It's 32 horsepower. Big zero-turn Kubota diesel lawnmower, but my replacement lawnmower is 25 or 24 and a half horsepower because anything over 25 horsepower now has to have diesel exhaust fluid and a bunch of these EPA restrictive particulate filters on the diesel engines. So now they're manufacturing diesel engines for my lawnmower under 25 horsepower. So now I wouldn't have an option. I'd have to get this electric riding lawnmower. And of course, Minnesota's, I don't know if it's the only state that's passed this. Maybe California has too, but the manufacturers just aren't there. I went and looked at commercial riding zero-turn lawnmowers that are battery powered. And besides the fact that they're $20,000, they just don't last very long. And they're not going to be. I'm on my lawnmower for 5 hours mowing my acreage down here. This for the city people, which this mostly is written for. I think it's just going to drive sales out of state.
Yeah, clearly it will. I wonder. I haven't looked at this bill. I am curious as to whether or not it would ban me ordering a gas mower or chainsaw or something from Amazon. Like if it's coming from out of state. Yeah. First of all, how would you know? Like I don't know how they would impose that with the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. You can't ban me purchasing something from out of state that's legal to purchase in that state. I don't think. So it'd be interesting to dig into the details with this. But yeah, this is just another attack on, it's an attack on literally everyday Minnesotans. You're telling people that they can't mow their lawns, they can't blow leaves. They got to spend money that they don't have because you keep making everything more expensive on equipment that's going to function poorly in comparison to what they already have. It's like they want to lose. I mean, you take this and view it in the context of everything they're doing on elections. And it's like, yeah, they have to rig the elections as much as they possibly can in order to bolster them against the blowback that all these terrible policies is going to generate. I mean,
Well,
it's going to be the easiest thing in the world to fundraise and campaign going into 2024 with all of this nonsense.
Well, I once, when I had breakfast with Thomas Massey and we're talking about campaigns, and, I asked him, I voted against a lot of bills. And so there's a lot of negative blowback against me for, sticking to the Constitution and being a constitutional conservative. I'm like, how do you handle voting against all those bills? And he said, how many mailers are they going to send against you? 4, 5? Once you voted against those 5 bills, it doesn't matter after that. You've already got the Democrats on the ropes for 4 or 5 just majorly destructive bills they've passed. The lawnmower thing isn't going to even be on your mailer, and
Right.
so they can just cram all this crap through and under the shadow of these massive bills that they've changed. The business community in Minnesota is finally waking up, I hope. There's so many of these corporations that have been overly woke. You've been to the Chamber of Commerce dinner, the Minnesota Business Partnership, and you see these major corporations that, especially during COVID, were like extremely woke, but then privately concerned about Walz's policies. And their wokeness, which the Democrats see as a big flag. I see that all these corporations had these, transgender flags flying in your corporate offices. So you must evidently want all this stuff, and we're going to force this on you. The business community is now all of a sudden going, hey, wait a minute, this, paid family leave, all these new taxes and fees. And I mean, is the business community finally waking up? Are they going to have the strength to push back against Democrats?
I think they are waking up, certainly anecdotally, in terms of the conversations that I'm having with whether it's local utilities or local businesses, local chambers. The feedback that I'm getting, it's a mixed bag. So they have this tightrope that they need to walk, right? Because the Democrats are in charge. And if you come out guns blazing against the people who are in charge, there's a rational fear that they're just going to lean on you harder and punish you for being a dissident to their woke agenda. But at the same time, in an act of self-preservation, these companies are coming out and saying, and sometimes it's like the entire chamber when it comes to something like paid family medical leave, statewide, coming out and saying, we can't do this. This is going to destroy us. 158 businesses in the Brainerd Lakes area put out a letter against paid family medical leave in terms of how it's going, saying that it's going to decimate and destroy that entire community. It just won't work. You can't find temporary workers up in these rural communities. And it's these one size fits all policies that are designed by a bunch of metro woke liberals that theoretically might function in Minneapolis or St. Paul, but there's just no way it's going to function somewhere up like Brainerd. And people are waking up, but I would say it's going to require more than just lodging your objection to what the Democrats are doing. There needs to be a categorical rejection of the entire ideology. So all these companies are play footsie with things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. They play footsie with things like going green and carbon free and net neutral, blah 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 blah. Because for the same reason that a thing of yogurt has low fat on the side of it, or gluten free or GMO free or whatever, it's a branding thing. That's all it is. It's being able to slap a sticker on your product and say, look at us, we're carbon free. Look at us, we're net neutral. Look at us, we're saving the planet. It's a value add to the brand. And they have eagerly accepted the marketing value add to their brands in an effort to be capitalists, be good old capitalists, and have not appropriately counted the cost of what they were empowering by doing so. Because every time you as a company affirm the goal of equity, affirm diversity, equity, and inclusion, affirm going green, affirm carbon free and net neutral, and this, that, and the other thing. By affirming those things, you are granting what is called moral sanction to the underlying ideology and the policies that emerge from it. So you gave them permission. You gave them permission by adopting all of their talking points and their marketing taglines. You gave them permission to impose paid family medical leave on you. You gave them permission to impose carbon free by 2040. You gave them permission to impose earn safe and sick time. By going along with their rhetoric and eagerly embracing the taglines for marketing purposes, you provided them with the moral sanction to be able to turn around and claim this stuff is supported by the community. This stuff is supported by Minnesotans. This stuff is supported by business. And by the time you get around to being like, oh, wait a minute, that's not what I wanted. I didn't want that. It's too late because you've already given them the power and they're already doing it. And so there needs to be a categorical rejection by business, by municipalities. I've had the same thing you talked about in terms of the disparity between public and private comments. I've had the same thing noticed in like with the League of Minnesota Cities and the Association of Minnesota Counties, where I talk to people and there's one line publicly of, oh, this is going to be okay. We're all going to get through it together. But then you talk to people individually, you talk to people privately, and they're deeply concerned about the impact on their tiny city, like a city of Albertville where I live, on giving employees 24 weeks of paid family medical leave. And then your financial director walks out the door and you've got nobody who knows where the spreadsheets are for half a year. I mean, it's absolutely nuts what the Democrats are doing. And there needs to be a larger scale, more vocal and intense rejection of it. Otherwise, it's going to continue.
Yeah. Well, as the driver's license for all bill passed the Senate yesterday and is going to the governor's desk, somebody posted a picture of a letter that the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and AgriGrowth, this big collection of agricultural businesses, and Minnesota Milk put out in support of that bill. And I want to just remind the listeners, this bill was to give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants. Any lawful immigrant to this country, whether they have a work visa or not, they can go get a driver's license. So this bill was specifically for people who are here without permission and are breaking federal immigration law. And these employers are breaking federal employment law and state employment laws by hiring people who don't have a green card, who don't have permission to work. This letter is in support of them, saying that they need this bill for their workers. They call them immigrant workers, but they're not immigrant workers. They're people that are here without permission and breaking federal law. These employers are basically asking the legislature to aid and abet them in breaking federal law, and they did get something from the Democrats that they really wanted, and that's to have a separate class of worker that they can continue to pay less than people that have permission to work in this country. So I've had a love-hate relationship with the chamber as they push for regulations on small businesses to box out competition and do stuff like this. But at the same time, they've pretended that they want 100% renewable. They've talked about how net carbon neutral they are, and now when they get it, their energy costs are going to go through the roof. We're going to have we already have employers deciding they're going to pull out of our state or not expand in our state, and jobs are going elsewhere. And Minnesotans are going to suffer because of this now growing disparity between the business environment here in Minnesota and just across the border in neighboring states.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to be nuts to move your business here. Like, why? I can't see why anybody would do that. And the only, that in every boardroom, in every C-suite, in every place where people have the capacity to potentially leave this state, that conversation is happening. How are we going to stick around?
Yeah. Well, Walter, I really appreciate you spending another hour going through legislation that you're seeing at the Capitol. I do want to give a shout out. It was It's been a year now since Jim Hagedorn's passing down here in the 1st District, and there was a lot of people sending out remembrances of him. We miss his humor and his energy and his conservatism representing us in D.C. I can't believe it's already been a year. It's been a whirlwind, that campaign for the special election to replace him. But I want to thank the listeners for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, and we'll talk with you again next week. So again, thank you for listening to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.